This is a special episode focused on a tragic crash that occurred last week when November 990 Papa Tango, a 7-month-old Cirrus SR22, lost control following an IFR approach to minimums at the Bar Harbor Airport in Maine and crashed onto the field. The pilot reportedly had a lot of experience in Cirrus aircraft, but experience doesn't always equate to proficiency. Join us as we talk about what happened on the approach and explore the crucial decisions that could have turned this tragedy into just another landing. Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation. My name is Max Truscott. I've been flying for 50 years. I'm the author of several books and the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year. And my mission is to help you become the safest possible pilot. Last week in episode 341, we talked about the crash of a Bonanza that lost power on takeoff and did a 180-degree turn back to the airport. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/341. And if you're new to the show, welcome. Great to have you here. Glad you found us. Now, if you would, so you can hear us again next week, just touch either the subscribe key or if you're using the Spotify or Apple podcast app, the follow key so that next week's episode is downloaded for free. And let me remind you that this is a listener-supported show and that we have lots of ways you can show your love and support for the show. If you would take a moment right now, just head on out to our new support page at aviationnewstalk.com/support, where you'll find links to support the show via PayPal, Patreon, Venmo, and Zelle. And when you make a donation, I'll read your name on the show. We'll get to the accident in a couple of minutes, but first I wanted to share an incident that, although it resulted in damage to an aircraft, had a relatively good outcome. Yesterday at the Naples Airport in Florida, an aircraft had an engine failure on takeoff. FlightSafety.org reports that, quote, a Beech A36 Bonanza suffered a loss of engine power on takeoff and made a gear-up landing on the remaining length of runway 5. Now, that's not exactly accurate. I've looked at several of the incident photos, and the aircraft came to rest in the grass between the end of the runway and the relatively short distance to the airport boundary fence. According to winknews.com, one person was on board the aircraft and there were no injuries. And according to Fox 4 Now, an airport spokesperson said the pilot didn't have enough time to lower the landing gear. Now, runway 5 is about 6,600 feet long. There are a few data points available on adsbexchange.com, and they show that the aircraft reached about 150 feet in the air before it started coming down again. Typical guidance to pilots of retractable landing gear aircraft is to not raise the gear until there's no usable runway left. So perhaps the pilot didn't follow this guideline, though ironically, landing gear up may have resulted in less damage to the aircraft. Photos show that the propeller tips are curled, so the engine will have to be torn down and inspected, but there's no other visible damage to the aircraft, though I'm sure there's some damage to the aircraft's belly. Now, had the gear been down when the aircraft touched down, it might have actually traveled farther and gone through the airport fence and onto a road. But landing with the gear up tends to make for the ultimate short-field landing. Aircraft sliding on a runway will usually stop in less distance than aircraft braking with their wheels on the runway. The incident provides a sharp and heart-rending contrast with the accident we talked about last week in 341, when the same model Bonanza took off from MacArthur Airport in Long Island, but didn't use the full length of the runway. That aircraft had engine problems and crashed while turning back to the field. And let me tell you about our video of the week. Patreon supporters have already seen this video, and I'll provide a link where everyone can see it. The video is of November 9 for November Golf, a Diamond DA42, which had a landing accident at about 7:18 p.m. Saturday night at AirVenture in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. Will Crow, an Aviation News Talk listener, shot the video and sent it to me a few hours later. He'd positioned himself next to the runway as he knew approaches to 18 left are difficult. The challenge is that aircraft need to keep their pattern south of runway 27, which was in use, and land on just the second half of 18 left. This plane was making left traffic to 18 left, and as you'll see in the video, the aircraft got slow and then had a very high descent rate for the last 40 feet, most likely because it stalled above the runway. There are two parts to the video. The first part is Will's raw video of the approach to landing and the crash. And in the second part, I found the ADS-B data for this flight, which goes all the way to the ground, and I ran it through a simulator so you can see the cockpit view and instruments, including the ground speed, altitude, and vertical speed. I then superimposed that on top of the landing video so that you can see the ADS-B data and the video at the same time. What you'll see is that the aircraft never maintained a constant airspeed once it turned base. Instead, its airspeed decreased continually until the moment it crashed onto the runway. Now, a better technique is to have a target airspeed for each leg and maintain that airspeed on the leg. If instead you fly with a constantly decreasing airspeed, you'll need to trim continually, and if you don't, the force required on the elevator will continually increase. Also, if the airspeed is continually changing, you'll need to watch it like a hawk to assure you don't get slow. By contrast, if you're flying at a target airspeed and are properly trimmed, you can look away from the airspeed for a little longer without worrying that the aircraft will get slow. Now you can find the video by going out to patreon.com/aviationnewstalk, and I'll include a link to it in the show notes, which you can find at aviationnewstalk.com/342. And by the way, while you're on that page, please consider taking a moment to sign up for the show. You can sign up at various levels starting at $8 a month. And if you sign up at the $20 a month level or higher, you'll immediately have access to all 92 videos I've posted for Patreon supporters. There are also higher support levels that you can donate at, where you can get access to my online courses or where I'll mail you a signed copy of one of my books. If you'd prefer, you can also make a one-time donation via PayPal, Venmo, or Zelle. So if you would, stop what you're doing for a couple of minutes, go look at the video with the Diamond DA42, and sign up on Patreon. Or to make a donation another way, go to aviationnewstalk.com/support. And when you do, I'll read your name on the show. And since aviation is a small community, see if you know any of these three supporters who've signed up to support the show in the past week. First, we have a new mega supporter at the $50 a month level. That's Raj Nair. And we also have another Patreon supporter, Yulia Buguen. And finally, we have a one-time donation for PayPal from Patrick Wiggins. Thanks so much for not just listening to the show, but also participating by supporting the show. Now let's talk about the fatal accident in Maine. First, our condolences to the family and friends of the pilots and his passenger. These are terrible tragedies, but the reason we talk about them is so that we can learn from them and hopefully save the lives of others who may find themselves in similar situations. I think when the NTSB writes their final report on the accident of November 990 Papa Tango, the probable cause will include words such as the pilot's failure to maintain adequate airspeed, which resulted in an aerodynamic stall and loss of control. While we don't know today for sure why the pilot lost control, the NTSB may get a fairly good idea after they download data from the aircraft's data module located in the tail, which records dozens of parameters, much like an airliner flight data recorder. However, already a few of the pilot's decisions stand out, and had they been made differently, we perhaps wouldn't be talking about this accident. I was recently reading the book Pre-Accident Investigations by safety expert Todd Conklin, and I was struck by something he said. He wrote that, quote, aviation accidents are the unexpected combination of normal aviation variability. And in this case, if a couple of variables had been different, there might have been a more positive outcome. Instead, as you'll see, the challenges this pilot faced kept stacking up. The aircraft took off from Morristown, New Jersey on Thursday morning at about 10:15 a.m. for the roughly 2-hour and 10-minute flight to Bar Harbor. I decided to listen to the aircraft's communications on the ground at Morristown and didn't expect to hear anything out of the ordinary, but I was struck by a few minor things. Here's the first transmission from liveatc.net when November 990 Papa Tango called for its IFR clearance. Listen carefully and see if you can hear what the pilot missed in his readback.
Hello, clearance, Cirrus 990 Papa Tango IFR to Bar Harbor.
Cirrus 990 Papa Tango, Morristown, clearance 32, Rockstar Airport via Morristown 7 departure. Radar vector 2, breezy. Filed, timing thing 2000, expect 900,000, 10 minutes after departure is on 119.2 and 121013.
Morristown 7 radar vector is the breezy, then it's filed 3000, expect 9er, 19.2, squawk 1013 for Papa Tango.
Did you hear the three things the pilot missed in his readback? He did not read back his clearance limit, which was cleared to the Bar Harbor Airport. He said his initial altitude was 3,000 instead of 2,000, and for the expected altitude of 9,000, he didn't mention that it would be after 10 minutes. That's a lot to miss in a readback, but it's not terribly unusual. What did seem unusual to me, as you'll hear next, was that the pilot was so confident that he'd gotten everything right, he assumed that the problem was not his readback, but that the controller didn't hear him for some reason. Now that struck me as a little odd. Most pilots would realize that the reason a controller was reading a clearance again was because the pilot got something wrong. And if the controller hadn't heard the pilot, You'd expect the controller would say something to that effect. Here's the rest of that conversation with clearance delivery.
Sierra Papa Tango, we're present to be Morristown 7 departure, radar vector to breeze is filed. Initial altitude 2000, 9010, 19.2, 100.2 for the frequency, and 1012 on the squawk.
Papa Tango, I said that back to I don't know what happened. I thought I read it back to him. Me to say it again.
Sierra Papa Tango, clearance to Bravo, Hotel Bravo, Airport via the Morristown 7 departure, radar vector to breezy, as filed. Climbing from 2000, like 900,000, 10 minutes after. Departure frequency 119.2, and your clock is 1013.
Okay, Papa Tango, do you hear me, sir?
Hey, firm, how do you hear me?
Yeah, I don't know. I didn't have any. He didn't hear me read it back. So I'll do it again. No problem, sir. Morristown 7, radar vector to breezy, and then 5, 3000, click 9 and 10, 19.2, squawking 1013.
And Sierra Papa Tango, to the initial altitude 2,000 feet, not to be 2,000 feet, then 900,000, 10 minutes after.
Correcting my initials up to the 2000. Papa Tango, thank you, sir.
Sierra Papa Tango, read this correct. Advise found your IFR when you press it.
The other conversations on the ground were fairly normal, though the pilot doesn't seem to realize that the rules of radio communication are that you read back either the full call sign or the last 3 characters of the call sign. In this case, that would have been 0 Papa Tango. But throughout most of his conversations, I heard this pilot always referring to himself by the last 2 letters, Papa Tango. Now, neither the call sign issue or the readback problem by themselves would have struck me as particularly problematic. But when we view them in the full context, which is that this pilot had a fatal accident, these minor mistakes take on a little more significance. When I fly, I always try to avoid the little mistakes, because if I do, then hopefully I'll be avoiding the big mistakes. This pilot had several little mistakes before he even left the ground. And now here's another mistake that occurred just 4 minutes after takeoff. Here's the controller's instruction.
0 Papa Tango to work breezy, maintain 6,000.
2 minutes later, the plane was still not direct to breezy, and the controller calls again.
0 Papa Tango to work breezy, maintain 6,000.
Note that the pilot was initially getting vectors, so the autopilot would have been in heading mode. When he was cleared direct to breezy, he probably did the direct enter function used to go direct to a waypoint. But if he did do that, he forgot to do something else, which I sometimes see when teaching, and that is that he forgot to go to the autopilot and switch it from heading mode to nav mode. And so the controller had to call him again. Again, a small mistake, but seeing so many small mistakes so early in the flight makes one wonder about the pilot's proficiency. And 13 minutes after he was instructed again to go to breezy, the pilot totally missed a radio call to change to another frequency, and so the controller had to call him again. Again, not a big mistake in itself, but in the context of all the other mistakes, a picture is starting to emerge. But the single biggest issue in the accident sequence was the weather, and it does call into question the pilot's decision-making. Before the pilot departed Morristown, the weather at Bar Harbor was reported as variable at 3 knots, 1 1/4 mile visibility, light rain, mist, overcast at 100, temperature 16, dew point 16, altimeter 3003. But this was an improvement from an hour earlier when it was 100 at 5 knots, 1/4 mile visibility, light rain, fog, overcast 100, temperature 16, dew point 16, altimeter 3005. So while the visibility had improved, the ceiling was still 100 feet overcast, and the airport was below the minimums for its instrument approaches. Though perhaps the pilot found hope in the TAF, the Terminal Aerodrome Forecast. It said for 1500 Zulu, about an hour before the pilot would arrive, that the weather would be 150 at 7 knots, visibility greater than 6 miles, showers in the vicinity, broken 400 feet. Still not great, with the ceilings just 200 feet above the instrument approach minimums. So low ceilings at Bar Harbor were an issue this pilot must have been thinking about if he got a weather briefing. But here's a much, much bigger issue that this pilot may have missed. And it's not something that might jump right out at you if you're casual in your approach to weather briefings. And here it is. The low ceilings that were present at Bar Harbor were widespread throughout much of Maine for most of the day. Think of the implications of that. If you don't see the runway at Bar Harbor and have to go mist, where are you going to go instead? I looked at the METAR history for nearby airports, and most of them were reporting clouds at 200, 300, or 500 feet overcast, which makes you wonder whether the accident pilot had thought about where he would fly to if he had to go mist. The problem when you have low weather everywhere is that if you have to go mist at one airport and you're surrounded by airports with poor weather, it's not obvious which airport you should go to next. This is especially critical if you've flown a long trip and you don't have a lot of fuel to go mist the second time at a different airport. In these kinds of situations, you have to pick a second airport where you have a high confidence of getting in. And here's a related issue. Just because the weather is, say, 400 feet overcast, doesn't mean it will stay that way. Weather is highly variable. So when the ceilings are low, the weather could get worse before you arrive. So you can envision a scenario where you go mist at your first airport, fly to another airport and have to go mist there as well, because the weather is slightly worse than reported. And now you could really be in trouble with high stress and low fuel levels, because now you have to get to a third airport and pray that the same thing doesn't happen again. So look at it this way. If you're flying to an airport with poor weather, surrounded by lots of other airports with equally poor weather, why would you even bother taking off? If you do, you may find yourself boxed in with few good alternatives if you have to go mist. And once you've taken off, and then later realize your predicament, does it make sense to continue to your original destination and hope that the weather gods are smiling on you and that by pure luck things will work out for you? A better strategy when en route with widespread poor weather is to not fly to your original destination, but to divert early to someplace where the weather is good enough that there's little chance that you'll have to go mist. As I searched around Maine, I found that at the time of the accident, the one airport in the area that met that criteria was Lewiston, Maine. At the time, the weather there was reported as 10-mile visibility and 800 feet overcast. Now, 800 feet overcast is not great, but it was hundreds of feet better than any of the other airports in the area. Not only that, Lewistown had an ILS with 200-foot minimums, so the clouds were 600 feet above the minimums at that airport. And here's the kicker. Although that airport is 86 miles away from Bar Harbor, it was along the route of flight, so the aircraft would have flown close to it while en route. Sometimes when the weather is poor at the destination, I'll spend most of the entire flight discussing alternatives with a client, and we may change our destination multiple times as we find better and better options for landing. Because you never want to find yourself boxed in because you flew to an airport with poor weather, surrounded by other airports with poor weather. Far better to stop along the way, or even divert a long ways away, so that you can get to an airport where the weather is good enough that it's unlikely to go below minimums before you get there. By the way, when I'm in these kinds of situations, which are relatively rare, I'm almost always with another pilot, so it's natural for us to have these kinds of conversations en route. But the accident pilot was flying with a lady passenger, and in these situations, there may be a tendency for pilots to be more involved with casual conversations than with considering alternatives for their flight. And yet, a passenger could be helpful in bringing a pilot back to the big picture, which is that the goal of any flight is to not land at your destination, but to land safely somewhere. Now let's talk about the instrument approach into Bar Harbor. While we can hear the approach controller giving instructions to November 990 Papa Tango, liveatc.net didn't pick up the pilot side of the conversation, probably because of the location of the receiver they used to pick up Bangor approach. Pilot flew the ILS-22 approach into Bar Harbor. Interestingly, there is also a WASP-based approach, the RNAV GPS-22 at Bar Harbor, and it has minimums that are identical to those of the ILS approach. Those minimums are 283 feet MSL, or 200 feet AGL, and 3/4 mile visibility. However, there was a NOTAM that said that the approach lighting system at Bar Harbor was out of service. Now, this is one of the normal aviation variabilities that Todd Conklin was talking about in his book. Since the ALS was out of service, the visibility minimums increased from 3/4 mile to 1 mile. The weather around the time of the accident was reported to be 1.5 miles visibility, light rain and mist, and overcast at 300 feet. The winds before the accident were 140 at 4, and after the accident, 160 at 8. So the clouds were approximately 100 feet above minimums, and the visibility was 1/2 mile above the visibility minimums, in light rain and mist. So this approach was barely above minimums, and the approach lights were out of service, making it even harder to identify the runway environment. So this would have been a challenging approach for any pilot. And yet there was still one more normal aviation variability. On the chart for the ILS-22 approach is a note that says autopilot coupled approach NA below 900 feet MSL. Now that NOTAM would have been the result of an FAA flight check aircraft flying the approach and determining that there were problems with the signal, most likely the glide slope, below 900 feet. So for about the last 600 feet of the approach, which would have been a little over a minute of flying time, the pilot would have been required to hand fly the approach while also looking for the runway in light rain and mist. If the pilot happened to miss the NOTAM and left the autopilot on, the aircraft could have pitched unpredictably as the aircraft descended to minimums. Given that the RNAV GPS-22 approach was available with the same minimums and that the entire approach could be flown with the autopilot, it is surprising that the pilot didn't elect to fly the RNAV GPS-22 approach instead of the ILS. Frankly, when given that choice where the minimums are the same, I will always choose the RNAV approach because there's less button pushing required, which makes it less prone to error. We'll see in a moment how having chosen the ILS versus the RNAV approach may have contributed to the accident. By the way, there may be subtle factors present that gently nudge a pilot to use an ILS approach, even when he or she might prefer to use an RNAV approach. For example, often the ATIS at towered airports will advertise that ILS approach is in use, without saying that other approaches are also available. Also, the controller handbook and many airline SOPs call for an ILS to be used to back up a visual approach. So controller expectations are that the airliners they deal with will tend to favor an ILS approach over other approaches. And sometimes a controller will forget that a GA aircraft has asked for something other than an ILS approach and will make references to the ILS. A non-assertive pilot might not speak up and say, "Hey, we were requesting the RNAV approach," and instead conclude, "Well, I guess the controller wants me to use the ILS." Whenever you fly, always request the approach that you want to fly, and don't be subtly nudged into a different approach. Controllers will almost always let you fly the approach you prefer, but you may have to request your preferred approach multiple times as the system seems biased toward flying ILS approaches. One of the things I've learned in the past year is that some ADS-B-equipped aircraft transmit the autopilot modes in use, so we can sometimes see which autopilot modes were in use at each stage of an approach. Though not all of the autopilot modes are transmitted, and not all flight-following websites display this data. Another issue is that for any particular area, some flight-following websites are able to receive ADS-B transmissions at lower altitudes than other websites. So often we have a mix of data in a less complete picture than we might like. For example, autopilot modes can be seen on adsbexchange.com, but for this particular flight, the last data point they captured for the accident flight was just inside the final approach fix. However, FlightAware.com captured ADS-B data nearly down to minimums, but it doesn't display the autopilot modes. So here is what we do know. The accident aircraft intercepted and tracked the ILS and did a reasonably good job of tracking the glide slope. When the aircraft was on the final intercept vector to join the approach autopilot was in the altitude hold mode. However, after joining the approach mode, which is required to track a glide slope, was not selected. Normally, I recommend that pilots press the autopilot's approach key when they hear the words "cleared for the approach." At first, I thought that not choosing approach mode was an oversight by the pilot, and it may have been, but it's possible he purposely chose the vertical speed mode to loosely track the glide slope to get around the prohibition for using the autopilot below 900 feet. However, the restriction doesn't say you cannot use the autopilot to track the glide slope. It says that you cannot use the autopilot to couple to the approach below 900 feet, which means you cannot use the autopilot at all below 900 feet. The last data point on ADS-B exchange is at 1,800 feet, and the autopilot was still on. But we don't know whether it was later turned off as required for this approach. We do know that just inside the final approach fix, the autopilot was on, but not in approach mode, so most likely it was in vertical speed mode. We do have data from FlightAware.com that shows that the approach was flown relatively precisely. However, there is a gap of 37 seconds between the last two data points. Here are those two data points in FlightAware, and I've corrected the altitudes I'm telling you for local barometric pressure. The next to the last point showed the aircraft at 80 knots at 410 feet, or about 130 feet above minimums. The last data point is disturbing. It shows the aircraft at 52 knots at 310 feet, or about 30 feet above minimums. And that last data point was located about 1,000 feet short of the runway threshold, where if the aircraft were on the glide slope, it would have been at about 100 feet MSL. So here's what I think happened in that missing 37 seconds. I believe that the aircraft continued to descend on the glide slope, and it went down to minimums of 283 feet. At some point, it then began a climb out to go missed and got slow during that climb out, which is why we saw the 52 knot speed. Throughout the approach, the aircraft course had been very constant at about 205 degrees. But notably, the last data point showed about a 10-degree turn to the right, which may have been the beginning of a stall spin sequence. A motorist driving by captured a faint image of the aircraft crashing in what appeared to be a near vertical descent, though it's difficult to see in the mist. 2 seconds later, the fire started. Regardless, there is one important implication of the pilot not selecting approach mode and perhaps using vertical speed mode instead. When in approach mode, the autopilot will not level off at the DA or decision altitude. Instead, it will continue descending on the glide slope, which is what you wanted to do when flying a precision approach. However, ADS-B data shows that the autopilot was on, at least until just inside the final approach fix, but it was not in the approach mode or altitude hold mode. So most likely the pilot was using vertical speed mode. If he had the altitude selector set to the minimums of 283 feet, the autopilot would have treated this as an MDA, since it wasn't in approach mode, and it would have leveled off at 283 feet. And if the pilot didn't promptly add power, the aircraft would have slowed down, something I see all the time when pilots forget to add power when they are descending and level off at an altitude. In most aircraft, this would lead to an autopilot-induced stall. However, this was a late model Cirrus SR22, and in that aircraft, a series of warnings would come up, and then the underspeed protection system would kick in, preventing an autopilot-induced stall. There would be a min speed enunciator on the PFD, and an audible alert that says airspeed, which is very loud and hard to ignore. And then a couple of seconds later, a stall enunciator and the underspeed protection active enunciator would come on, and the aircraft would start descending at a speed a few knots above stall speed. Essentially, the aircraft is trading altitude for airspeed to try to prevent a stall. But these functions would only work if the autopilot were still on. It's entirely possible that a pilot, upon hearing the airspeed oral alert, might disconnect the autopilot, which would turn off this underspeed protection. There is one other aspect of the way this aircraft operates, which adds yet another normal aviation variability. Since this was a late model Cirrus aircraft, it had a yaw damper that automatically comes on as you climb through 200 feet AGL and automatically turns off as you descend through 200 feet AGL. And while this is an excellent function to have for most of the flight, because it operates the rudder for you, over the long term, it could lead some pilots to become lazy in their use of the rudder. If the accident aircraft descended below 200 feet AGL, the minimums for the approach, the yaw damper would have turned off. Then, if the pilot added full power, especially if he did it suddenly, and didn't add any additional right rudder, the aircraft would tend to yaw left and roll to the left. This could contribute to an unusual attitude and loss of control, especially if the aircraft were already slow. And we know the aircraft was slow at just 52 knots ground speed for the last data point. How might the aircraft have gotten that slow? If the pilot disconnected the autopilot and then added full power, the aircraft would have pitched up unless the pilot simultaneously added forward pressure on the side stick. Flight instructors see these pitch-ups in all types of aircraft doing go-arounds, and especially on simulated engine failures, when an aircraft is trimmed for best glide speed and then full power is applied. While on the approach, the autopilot would have trimmed this aircraft for its approach speed, which should be 100 knots on a Cirrus. When full power is suddenly applied with the autopilot off, the aircraft tries to maintain its current trimmed airspeed, and it does that by pitching up rapidly. And if a pilot isn't quick to push forward on the stick, the aircraft overpitches and can get dangerously slow. This is even more likely to occur in IMC or poor visibility, when the pilot doesn't have an outside horizon to compare to the aircraft's pitch. So this is one possible reason that the accident aircraft got so slow at the end. By the way, late model Cirrus aircraft like this one are some of the few aircraft that don't require you to disconnect the autopilot to fly a missed approach. At minimums, instead of disconnecting the autopilot, you simply push the takeoff go-around or toga button, add full power, and the aircraft will start to climb. You then raise the flaps and push the nav and FLC buttons on the autopilot. So flying the missed approach in these aircraft is more simple than in most aircraft, because you can leave the autopilot on, which is my preferred way to fly a missed approach. As we've talked about before, go-arounds and missed approaches are difficult because most pilots don't practice them often. And when you execute a missed approach in low visibility, pilots can be stressed as they know they're close to the ground and there's not much room for error. So most of us can use more practice flying go-arounds and missed approaches so that we'll perform them correctly when we have to do them for real. And that is part of the pilot mantra, which is to train, train, train. So from a big picture standpoint, you have to wonder why this pilot didn't postpone his trip by a day when there were widespread low ceilings throughout Maine for much of the day, or why he didn't divert to Lewistown and perhaps drive to Bar Harbor, and why he didn't choose to fly the RNAV approach when it didn't have the autopilot limitations of the ILS approach. We'll probably never know the answers to those questions, but eventually we probably will learn a little more about the exact sequence of events that preceded the pilot's loss of control. And here's one key takeaway. There is lots of normal variability in flying. The vast majority of time, things go well in our flights and we have a safe landing. But sometimes one or more things are working against us. And if we let those things stack up, we can occasionally find ourselves in a situation where everything then has to go right because we no longer have any margin for error. In these cases, a single mistake, like the failure to properly execute a missed approach, can lead to an accident. But here's the problem. We're all human, and even the very best of pilots still make mistakes. So when possible, you want to build extra safety margin into everything you do and avoid situations where everything has to go right. Because in those situations, if you do make a mistake, it may be game over. The most important decisions we make are those that we make before we leave the ground. Please don't work yourself into a situation where you need all of your skill and some luck to get out of it. Now, before we wrap up, let me just say that if you're in the market for a headset, please consider buying the only headsets I use, the Lightspeed headsets. I love the new Lightspeed Delta Zulu because I can fine-tune its audio response to compensate for my hearing loss, which I have at both lower and higher frequencies. And when you buy a Lightspeed headset, they will donate to help support this show, but only if you get to their website by first going to our website at aviationnewstalk.com/Lightspeed. So if you're going to buy a Lightspeed, start by going to aviationnewstalk.com/Lightspeed. And if you have comments on this episode or on anything related to the podcast, please send me an email. The best way to send me a message is to go to aviationnewstalk.com and click on Contact at the top of the page. And of course, I may end up reading your email on a future show. We also love it when you leave a 5-star review on whatever app you're listening to us right now. But most importantly, please tell one or more of your friends about the show, because that's the primary way that we grow the show. So until next time, fly safely, have fun to keep the blue side up, and remember that you can always go around.